A Wild West performer lies dead on his kitchen floor.
911, what is your emergency? I need an ambulance real fast. There's blood all over.
There were 8 entrance wounds, 4 in the head, 3 in the upper chest. He was dressed as a cowboy, dressed all in black from his boots to his hat. He was known by Black Bart.
His grieving widow has a colorful past.
She was one of Hugh Hefner's first Playboy bunnies.
She taught Catholic school by day and Playboy bunny by night. She had a double life.
The investigation into her husband's murder reveals they had plenty of enemies.
They would do gunfight shows on property on the weekends.
I did ask him if he ever had his ass kicked, and I offered to do it.
Her husband didn't know about it, and she didn't want him to know about it.
The question is, which of their foes killed Black Bart?
His attitude, I have said, someday somebody is going to shoot him.
That just eventually led into, yeah, we'd like to see him dead.
There's nothing worse than being betrayed by a loved one. And that's what it was.
Desert nights outside Phoenix, Arizona are normally quiet and peaceful. But at 10:30 p.m. on October 20th, 1992, a resident in an upscale neighborhood comes home to violence.
911, what is your emergency? Yeah, my name is Carole. I need an ambulance real fast. My husband's on the kitchen floor. There's blood all over. I think he's dead.
Officers get to the scene, and the woman who called Carole Gold, she leads them inside the house, and they find her husband on the ground.
He was dressed as a cowboy, all in black, from his boots to his hat. It kind of jumped out at you. And he had a Western-style belt with a big buckle on it that said Black Bart on it. The victim was identified by his wife, Carole. He was known by either Chuck or Black Bart.
After securing the crime scene, Phoenix police officers notify the homicide division. The first detective on the scene is Joseph Petrosino.
When I got there really wasn't a lot of blood. There were 8 entrance wounds, 4 in the head, 3 in the upper chest, and 1 which was through the wrist. One of the wounds is behind the ear. I suspect that would have been one where he was down on the floor, and it's just, we're just going to make sure that he doesn't get up off the floor, execution style.
As Detective Petrosino moves into the living room, he notices a strange detail.
I had a chair in the living room, and I can see that the chair has been moved, and I can see that something had been behind the chair, which appeared to be shoe prints. And it's right close to the entrance to the kitchen, so that if you came around that corner, you would have immediately been able to see who's in the kitchen. I suspect that once he went into the room, he was confronted almost immediately, and the shooting began.
I think it could have been a robbery gone wrong. The robber broke in, and then Chuck scared him.
He died the way a lot of Old West criminals died, gunned down. He was ambushed.
They're looking at the crime scene, trying to figure out footprints, fingerprints, anything that was left behind. So you're left with all these questions. Was this somebody that broke in? Was this a targeted attack on Chuck Gold's life?
Chuck Gold was born in March 1941 and grew up in Illinois as one of 4 boys in a close-knit family.
He grew up in an area of Chicago called Rogers Park, and with very loving and doting parents. They were very good, close brothers. They were raised in a kosher home in a nice Jewish neighborhood.
Growing up, he was very much interested in the West and the cowboys. He rode horses a lot, every chance he had, and worked pretty close with them.
What kid of the 40s and 50s wasn't drawn to gunfights and cowboys?
As a teenager, Chuck traded his Western wear for an army uniform, serving several years in Germany.
He joined before he graduated high school. I've been told he did cross paths with Elvis around the time that Elvis actually was leaving the army. My dad was out in 61, I believe. My parents met shortly after.
Chuck met his first wife in 1961. The two married soon after and had one daughter, Stephanie.
My mom was young. They separated when I was 9 months old, and they were divorced by the time I was 2. After that, my father was married 5 times. My mother was his first wife. So I didn't know 2 and 3 at all. 4, I knew because she was the mother of my half-sister. But no relationships whatsoever with any of them.
Though Chuck's marriages didn't last, his love of the Wild West stayed true. He turned that passion into a career, managing horse stables near Chicago and putting on gunslinger exhibitions with staged battles, fashioning himself after the famous outlaw, Black Bart.
They got a stagecoach and they got horses, and they would do gunfight shows on property on the weekends.
In 1977, after 16 years working the Western show circuit, 36-year-old Chuck met the woman who would become his 5th wife, Carole Catini.
Carole was always into horses. Where Dad and Carole met was at a horse show.
She actually worked in the Playboy gift shop in Lake Geneva, and then she went and worked in the stables in Lake Geneva Club.
Carole had a 20-year history with the Playboy organization, starting with its first club in Chicago.
They opened the first club in 1960, and they needed bunnies, and Carole was one of the first rounds of girls hired. She was an original bunny.
Carole was trying to get a teaching degree. She wound up teaching at a Catholic school. You know, her joke was she taught Catholic school by day and Playboy bunny by night. So she had a double life.
By the time she met Chuck at a horse show, Carole had traded in her bunny ears for motherhood. She had 2 children from a previous marriage, including a son named Ashton. After a whirlwind romance, she and Chuck tied the knot and decided to open horse stables of their own.
They were doing very well. Lake Geneva, in the summer months, Lake Geneva, my Lord, it was a very busy town, and they did a big business.
Carole also supported Chuck in reuniting with his estranged daughter.
My dad was not part of my life when I was a child growing up. When I first reestablished my relationship with my father, they were running the stables at the Playboy Club in Lake Geneva. Carole was very open, very loving, very, very accepting, very sweet. I also met Ashton. He wasn't quite 10 yet, so he was this 9-year-old little kid. I said, "Do you mind having an older sister?" So they became my other family.
The Playboy Club closed in 1983, which put an end to Chuck and Carole's business as well. So they started over again in Phoenix, leasing stables at the upscale Hilton Resort.
The stable did tremendously well financially. Man, they were the single most financially successful stable of any of the valley back then.
I was 21 years old. My vacations were all in Arizona. I wound up working at the stables, and I did all of that with Carole. So my relationship was, she was my other mother. I called her mom. The dynamic between my father and Carole was amazing. Carole ran the stables, kept the books, and my father did the gunfight shows. He would go play and be Black Bart and drive the stagecoach. Whenever he was at the stables, he was always dressed as Black Bart. He was very happy.
Now, the man who spent years staging fake gunfights seems to have become the victim of a real one in his own kitchen.
Carole Gold is the one that made the 911 call. And immediately, officers and detectives need to ask her questions about Chuck. Did he have enemies? Was somebody possibly out to get him? Based on everything they learned, they start thinking, well, maybe we do need to look more into the family. Maybe there was a little more there than people were letting on.
Coming up, evidence suggests the crime scene isn't what it appears to be.
The scene didn't look like a robbery.
And an old grudge lends the investigation a suspect.
We had words, argument kinda, and trying to explain my side. He didn't want to hear about it.
Detectives are less than 2 hours into the investigation of the death of Chuck Gold. Before questioning his widow, police collect evidence at the crime scene.
We recovered 8 spent .22 caliber shell casings scattered about the kitchen.
There are 2 guns found in the kitchen, a .32 caliber pistol in a bag on the countertop, and a .22 attached to Chuck's belt buckle. The weapons don't appear to have been fired, suggesting to police the shooter had caught Chuck by surprise with their own .22 caliber weapon.
We also found the back door was not locked. That meant either somebody went out the door before I got there and unlocked the door and left it, or the door hadn't been locked in the first place.
How could this be a robbery when it seems so personal?
With no signs of a break-in, a botched robbery seems unlikely.
We never found a wallet, but as you go from room to room and look at stuff, there's nothing disturbed. Nobody's pulled out drawers and thrown stuff around. So somebody that's in there isn't looking for anything. The scene didn't look like a robbery.
With no evidence of a burglary, detectives surmise this was likely a targeted execution. While Detective Petrosino continues searching for clues, his partner Ed Reynolds questions Carole Gold.
She basically says they fight like normal people do, but in general, it's just a real good relationship. They had been married for 14 years.
Carole tells police that she had been working at the stables all day, started early in the morning, got off later, and then decided to go have dinner with her daughter from a previous marriage. It's at 10:30 that she arrives back at home, and that's when she tells detectives she found Chuck.
Carole's alibi should be easy enough to check out, but Detective Reynolds is also interested to know if she has any possible motive.
He asks about life insurance. In this particular case, Carole says that there is no big policy to her knowledge. Another area that gets touched on during that initial interview is fidelity. Is there any possibility that Chuck's got a girlfriend?
Carole tells officers that, yes, Chuck had had girlfriends in the past while they were married. She knew about it, but said it had been years since that had happened.
According to Carole, Chuck only had one enemy she knows of.
She tells police that they did have a former employee who did not get along with Chuck. His name was James Long Jr., and he went by Jimbo.
It's the guy that shoes the horses. And at some point after he's there, some materials get stolen from Chuck. A saddle, some guns.
Jimbo was fired because of this, but there had been some rumors among the employees at the horse stables that Jimbo wanted to get back at Chuck.
He'd made some threats, and the debate is were they threats or were he just, shooting his mouth off?
Before they follow up on the lead, they want to speak with Carole's 20-year-old son, Ashton, who also lives in the house.
He'd been paged that something happened to Chuck. He immediately came home and met up with the family, his sister, his mother. Ed talks to Ashton about, what's the deal between you and Chuck? How do you get along?
Ashton tells investigators that his dad had passed away years earlier when he was 4. So most of his life, it was Chuck Gold that had raised him. He'd refer to him as his dad, not his stepdad.
Ashton admits he hasn't always been the ideal stepson.
Ashton admits to the fact that he was on probation for a drug issue. But since he had been on probation, he had really gotten his life together and he was working, and there hadn't been any issue since.
Ashton says he's been working as a driver at the stables, and he agrees with his mother. If anyone wanted to hurt Chuck, it was Jimbo.
Ashton goes into a little more on Jimbo's criminal history, that he'd made some statements about he was going to take care of Chuck. So we now know Jimbo was a possible suspect. They're going to have to track down Jimbo.
Carole Gold and her son, Ashton Catini, have just given detectives a possible lead: Chuck Gold's blacksmith, Jimbo. But before detectives move on to Jimbo, Ashton offers one last insight into Carole and Chuck's relationship.
They asked Ashton, Chuck got a girlfriend? And he goes, yeah, her name's Jhene. If she's married, he's seen them together at the stable, but when there are other people around, they don't act like boyfriend and girlfriend, but everybody knew about it. Ashton mentions the fact that his mother doesn't seem to be upset by the girlfriend.
But Carole is telling detectives that Chuck hasn't had any girlfriends for at least a year. So that's definitely a break in what Carole knew to be true.
Now, we have to talk to Jimbo, and we have to find Jhene and see what she's got to say.
Investigators track down Jimbo the next day and question him about the allegations that he stole 2 of Chuck's pistols.
Chuck did try to accuse me of taking the guns. I told him that I didn't take them. It could have been a variety of people, but there was only 2 people with keys to that room. It was Chuck and Carole, and Ashton had access to either one of the sets of keys. I think I got arrested, and I was in jail for 3 days and got out, and there was no charges brought against me after that. They didn't have no evidence that I did it.
Jimbo had a temper, too. I know a couple of times I talked to him, he was not happy at all that Chuck fired him.
Jimbo admits he was angry at Chuck, but says he would never seek revenge.
When I met with Chuck, we had words, argument kinda, and trying to explain my side. Chuck didn't want to hear my side. There was never no threats. I did ask him if he ever had his ass kicked, and I offered to do it. After all the squabble over all of that, me and Chuck ended up getting along again. It just, what would you call it? Let bygones be bygones.
But according to Jimbo, there were any number of other people who didn't feel the same way.
Chuck's attitude, the way he went around people, just the lifestyle he lived of being a gunslinger, Black Bart, I have said, someday somebody is going to shoot him. Chuck didn't have a problem of telling people off, not saying it wished it up on him or nothing, but there's a lot of people dislike Chuck.
Other things that Jimbo responds to, he's able to verify that Jermaine and Chuck have some type of a relationship because he's seen Chuck kiss her at the stable.
Detectives also confirm that Jimbo was miles away at the time they believe the shooting took place.
I couldn't have done it. I was at Dynamite Arena from like 5 o'clock that evening until about 11 o'clock that night. Never left the premises.
He was in a public place. He's really got a good alibi. Following the interview, we go down the list, all the things that Carole and Ashton told us that we have been able to verify were untrue to some extent or another. So at this point in time, you have to go back and look at Ashton and Carole as being primarily suspects. The other investigative lead would be Jermaine. We have to track down Jermaine and find out what her situation is.
Coming up, investigators discover the cracks in a seemingly happy marriage.
She says that at one point, Carole told Chuck she didn't want to have sex with him anymore.
And a son's secret comes to light.
Apparently, he'd owed some drug dealers some money.
Following the interview with Chuck's former enemy, Jimbo, detectives tracked down Chuck's alleged girlfriend, Jermaine, to confirm there was an ongoing affair.
On the 27th of October, they had an interview similar to the one they had with Jimbo. She eventually verifies the fact that she and Chuck did have a sexual relationship, that her husband didn't know about it, and she didn't want him to know about it. They'd known each other since her son had taken riding lessons. They socialized, the four of them, she and her husband, Chuck and Carole.
Jermaine tells police the main issue she knows about between Carole and Chuck is their sexual relationship. She says that at one point, Carole told Chuck she didn't want to have sex with him anymore, and so that became almost platonic.
According to Jermaine, she and her husband were together the night of the murder. Detectives follow up on her alibi and are able to rule her out as a suspect. Investigators ask her when she last spoke to Chuck. Her answer seems to shockingly cast suspicion on his stepson, Ashton.
Chuck had called her just prior to the day of the incident and was angry, complaining about Ashton, the fact that Ashton is not carrying his part of the load. He's not working. He's a financial drain.
Jermaine says she doesn't have the details, but knows someone who might.
She told Ed that he needed to get with Richard Feingold, who is Chuck's right-hand man at the stable. He would know the ins and outs, the day-to-day of the stable, and he would be able to answer questions, reference the relationships between Chuck and Carole and Ashton, that kind of information. They head back out to the stables at the point and meet up with Richard Feingold.
He describes himself as this kind of best friend, confidant of Chuck Gold.
Richard says that Ashton is costing Chuck a lot of money for school that he's not going to, that he's got a criminal history that Chuck's trying to deal with.
I was at the stables quite often when Ashton would smoke pot at the stables. Chuck would catch him, and they didn't get along very well at all. Ashton smoking pot on the premises of the reserve is against the law for one. They could have lost everything they had. Just the wrong person walk in at the wrong time. The resort would have canceled the contract.
Richard also tells police that at this time, Ashton had this long-term drug problem.
Apparently, he'd owed some drug dealers some money, and Carole and Chuck, quote, bailed him out.
Richard says the name of Ashton's main drug dealer is Bob.
Richard says Ashton's not a reformed drug user. He's still doing drugs. His stepfather has a problem with him, and they aren't working through it. They're at odds.
Carole would act as a mediator as best she could between the two, and if push comes to shove, she would always stand up for her son, pretty much all the time.
Chuck had basically reached the end of his rope and wanted him out of the house. Richard says Chuck had given Carole an ultimatum. Ashton either goes or the both of you go. He told her that he had to be gone by October 31st. They could both go because he was going to divorce her.
This information comes as a shock to detectives because this is the first time they're hearing this. When they interviewed Carole and when they interviewed Ashton, none of this came up, and they both made it seem like things are pretty good between Chuck and Ashton.
Investigators discover Carole was also withholding information about something else.
There's an $150,000 life insurance policy on Chuck Gold, and Carole Gold is the main beneficiary.
Which goes back to, why is she telling the detective, I don't know anything about that insurance policy? That forces the needle from next of kin, grieving widow, to somebody that's lying to me. And I want to know why.
Coming up, will the true culprits face justice?
There was hope that my dad would get justice, that we would all be able to close that door.
And Ashton's dealer offers another side of the story.
And I kept saying, I'm not the shooter. I'm not the shooter.
The revelations about Carole Gold and her son Ashton have put them in detectives' crosshairs. To find out why they've been lying, investigators bring Ashton in for another round of questioning and confront him about what they know.
Sometimes we lie to suspects. The story is that we have an anonymous informant that said that you stole the guns and gave them to Bob. And Ashton was dumbfounded that we had the name Bob.
Ashton came off very concerned about his probation to detectives and admitted he had been using drugs up until Chuck's death.
Ashton still denies knowing anything about Chuck's murder, but he tells investigators if they're looking for Bob, they'll find him at the fitness center where he works.
We reach out to the Drug Enforcement Unit, and they know who Bob is. His last name's Pryor. He's a known distributor of synthetic heroin.
Detectives learn Bob Pryor is out on bail after agents raided his home during a recent drug sting.
When they served the search warrant, they found a box of 22 Stingers, which is the brand of shell casings that we recovered from the crime scene. And he was known to be in possession or the owner of a Ruger 22 semi-automatic pistol. So at this point, we now have a lot of circumstantial evidence that ties Pryor to Ashton.
Because Bob Pryor was in possession of the same type of ammunition used to murder Chuck, police consider the possibility he was the one who pulled the trigger.
Bob could be the weak link. If we can get enough on Bob, he can flip on who paid him or who hired him or who convinced him to do it.
The drug unit involved in the raid informs detectives about an associate of Pryor's named Dan Goddard, a career criminal who is currently working for them as an informant. If Pryor was involved in Chuck's shooting, Goddard might know.
Goddard comes down for an interview because of his relationship with the police department. He's trying not to go back to prison. That's why he's working as an informant. And so they ask him about, what does he know about Pryor?
Investigators get far more out of Goddard than they hoped for. He claims Pryor hired him to be his driver the night of the murder.
He outlines the fact that he got a call from Pryor who offered him $50 to drive him around, and he takes the money, and Pryor directs him as to where he wants to go. They do a drive-by on the house, and Pryor tells him to stop and let him out, tells him that he'll page him when he needs him to pick him up and where to pick him up at. Goddard's belief is that Pryor's probably going to go and collect money that's owed to him. Goddard drives around waiting for the page, and he gets the page. He picks Pryor up, and then they drive to a location where there's a canal, and Pryor gets out.
The real aha moment is when Dan Goddard actually drives detectives to where he went that night, and it's Chuck Gould's house.
After the fact, he put together that Pryor most likely killed Chuck Gould and got rid of the gun by throwing it in the canal.
And immediately after that interview, Ashton jumps to the top of the list. Could this murder have been a motive of Ashton being angry at his stepdad for wanting to kick him out of the house? And was Carole covering for her son? Detectives are now putting these puzzle pieces together that the two hired a hitman for the job.
Goddard's statement gives detectives probable cause to arrest Bob Pryor, Ashton Catini, and Carole Gould.
There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that showed that Carole was involved. Now you got to prove it.
When Carole and Ashton were first arrested, I was crushed. I mean, I had already lost my father. Now I've lost my family. I've been betrayed.
Unfortunately, the DA doesn't think they have enough to charge Carole.
They booked Ashton for first-degree murder along with Pryor, but they let Carole go. And the prosecutor said, all we have is the word of a known drug dealer or criminal, and we don't have enough to tie her to it.
Carole gets with an attorney, and she's able to get the charges dropped after spending just a short amount of time in jail. Because she's released, she's able to cash in on that life insurance policy.
Carole ends up spending most of the six-figure payout on defense attorneys for her son.
It's December of 1994. Ashton and Bob are both on trial for first-degree murder and conspiracy.
When Ashton and I went to trial, they called Dan Goddard because he's the one that snitched, but he was also under snitch agreement and was supposed to have done, told on all this stuff before it had happened.
Dan Goddard was given immunity because he agreed to testify against them.
They kept coming to me, wanting me to confess to being the shooter, and they would give me a deal to testify. And I kept saying, I'm not the shooter. I'm not the shooter.
The defense that is put up is that Chuck was sick and was dying, and he hired a hitman, so that would be assisted suicide. 11 out of the 12 jurors rejected that and felt that they'd actually committed murder for hire, but one juror hung the jury, so a mistrial was declared.
I was numb. I mean, there's no other word to describe it. The thing that I took in stride was the fact that the state still planned on pursuing further charges and would try them again. So there was hope that my dad would get justice, that we would all be able to close that door.
Prosecutors are gearing up to retry Bob Pryor and Ashton Cattini for the murder of Chuck Gold. But Detective Ed Reynolds still believes Carole Gold also needs to be charged.
He obtained the original documentation from the insurance company on the insurance policy.
They actually bring in a handwriting expert to say, hey, does this signature look like Chuck's signature? Because they thought maybe it was forged or maybe there was some fraud there.
The insurance policy was drawn up and taken out by Carole, and she signed his name to it.
But investigators need more for the DA to charge her. Out on bond, awaiting his new trial, Bob Pryor is the one who delivers it.
Shortly after being released, Pryor got arrested again for selling drugs, and he made a deal with the prosecutor to testify against Carole and Ashton for a reduced sentence.
They asked me if I would take a plea. And I said, what are we getting in return? And he gave us Carole. I said, done.
One year after the shooting death of Black Bart, Bob Pryor sits down with investigators to give his version of events.
Ashton started telling me about how much he did not like his stepfather, Chuck. I just figured it was a rich kid complaining about a stepfather. But it just eventually led into, yeah, we'd like to see him dead. He's been cheating on Carole. She wasn't young anymore. I guess she was one of Hugh Hefner's first Playboy bunnies, and she didn't have that to fall back on.
Did Ashton ever tell you anything to lead you to believe that his mom was involved in this too?
Yes.
What kind of stuff did he tell you?
That was her idea. She wanted it. She paid for it. They offered me $20,000.
Ashton was young during this time. I just assumed that Carole was the one running everything. Carole had the ultimate plan. There was an event that Chuck was going to, and when it was over and then he could come home, all we had to do was be waiting and shoot Chuck.
But Bob alleges that it was actually Dan Goddard who played the role of Triggerman.
What happened on the night of the murder?
Down over there and came back. And then...
How many times did he shoot him?
He didn't say. He didn't. He said he couldn't do it. I remember. He just said he just could pull the trigger.
When they told me what Dan Goddard said, what Dan did was he told the story and just switched the roles of me and him. And so I was like, oh hell no, this isn't the way it went.
Regardless of which man actually pulled the trigger, Bob's statement finally gives investigators enough evidence to arrest Carole. They charge her with first-degree murder and conspiracy, but she maintains her innocence.
I'm not talking to you.
Can you take the heat off of your son?
I can't.
You can't even do that.
No, I won't do that right now.
Both mother and son are tried together on August 5th, 1997, nearly 5 years after Chuck's death.
When I was brought in to testify at their trial, that's when Ashton realized he hasn't got a prayer.
Mid-trial, Ashton decides he wants to take a plea deal and gets 18 years in prison.
Carole, however, proceeds to trial.
Carole is eventually found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy in the death of her husband, Chuck Gold.
She was sentenced to 25 years to life with the possibility of parole after 25.
I think that Carole and Ashton got exactly what they deserved. Carole is the worst kind of mother there is. Evil, lying. Carole didn't pull the trigger, but she is just as responsible. There's nothing worse than being betrayed by a loved one.
I think that Chuck should be remembered as having fulfilled his dream. He died a cowboy.
His headstone says Charles Black Bart Gold. His parents approved that. I can't imagine anything else explaining more who he was.
The Architects of Deception, a novelization of shadow wives and stolen identities. Prologue, The Mask. The mirror does not lie, but the man staring into it does. In the soft glow of a California morning, 1979, the man who called himself Dr. Gerald Barnes adjusted his stethoscope. It was a prop, though a functional one. To the world, it was a symbol of healing, of authority, of a life dedicated to the preservation of pulse and breath. To Gerald Barnbaum, it was the final piece of a costume he had been perfecting since he left Chicago in a cloud of disgrace. He liked the weight of the lab coat. It had a specific stiffness, a clinical white that suggested purity. He practiced his doctor's smile in the glass worm, reassuring, just the right amount of paternal concern. He wasn't just a pharmacist with a revoked license anymore. He was an actor who had found the role of a lifetime, and the stage was the Pacific Southwest Medical Group. 400 miles away, the real Dr. Gerald Barnes was waking up in Stockton, unaware that his name, his hard-earned credentials, and his very soul had been harvested by a ghost. Chapter 1, The Assistant's Shadow. Rick D'Alessandro liked his boss. That was the problem. In the busy hallways of the Orange County Clinic, Dr. Barnes was a breath of fresh air. He was a likable little guy. As Rick would often describe him, quick with a joke, easy to talk to, and possessed of a charismatic energy that made patients feel better before he even examined them. Morning, Rick, Barnes said, breezing past the reception desk with a stack of charts. Beautiful day to save some lives, isn't it? Rick smiled, checking the clipboard. We've got a full house, Doc, 25 scheduled, and the walk-ins are already lining up. The more the merrier, Barnes replied, his eyes twinkling behind scholarly spectacles. Rick watched him go, a small frown creeping onto his face. There was something about the way Barnes handled the more complex cases, a certain hesitation, a reliance on routine prescriptions. But in a high-volume clinic, efficiency was king. Barnes was efficient. He was the director. He was the man with the answers. Or so everyone thought. Chapter 2, The December Chill. December 26, 1979. The holiday spirit was a fading echo, replaced by the gray reality of a winter morning. John Mackenzie walked into the clinic, and even from across the room, Rick could see the man was vibrating with exhaustion. At 29, Mackenzie should have been in the prime of his life, but he looked like a candle guttering in the wind. His skin was sallow, his eyes sunken, and his gait was unsteady. I don't feel right, Rick, Mackenzie whispered, his voice dry as parchment. Thirsty, so thirsty, and dizzy. It's like the floor won't stay still. Rick ushered him into exam room 3. The doctor will see you in a moment. John, hang in there. When Barnes entered the room, he didn't see a man on the brink of a diabetic coma. He saw a script to be followed. He listened to the complaints: excessive urination, dry mouth, the loss of equilibrium. inner ear disturbance, Barnes pronounced with the practiced ease of a veteran clinician. A touch of vertigo happens after the holiday stress, diet, the usual. He scribbled on a pad, an anti-vertigo drug, something to stop the spinning. But the thirst, Doc, Mackenzie asked, clutching a paper cup of water like it was a holy relic. Your body is reacting to the imbalance, Barnes said, patting him on the shoulder. Take the pills. We'll run some blood work just to be safe, but you'll be fine by New Year's. Barnes sent him home. He didn't check for the sweet scent of ketones on the man's breath. He didn't notice the classic signs of a body eating itself. He had 39 other patients to see. He had a role to play. And John Mackenzie was just a bit player in the grand drama of Gerald Barnbaum's ego. Chapter 3, 1200. The lab results came back the next day. Dr. Barnes was off, enjoying the perks of his stolen prestige. Rick D'Alessandro was the one who opened the folder. He expected the usual slightly elevated cholesterol, maybe a minor infection. Instead, he saw a number that made his heart stop. Glucose, 1,200 milligrams DL. Normal was 80 to 100. 1,200 was a death sentence. It was a level so high the blood was practically syrup. Oh, God, Rick whispered. He didn't wait for a supervisor. He didn't wait for Barnes. He grabbed the phone and dialed Mackenzie's number. Ring, ring, ring. No answer. He called the emergency contact Tan ex-wife. She hadn't seen him. He called the other numbers on the chart. Silence. A cold dread settled in Rick's stomach. He looked at the chart again. Barnes had prescribed an anti-vertigo medication. He had sent a man an active, acute diabetic crisis home with a pill for dizziness. I need the police, Rick told the dispatcher, his voice trembling. Garden Grove PD. We have a patient. I think he's in danger. Chapter 4, The Kitchen Floor. The officers broke the door in. The apartment was quiet, the air heavy with the stillness of a life interrupted. They found John Mackenzie in the kitchen. He was lying on the floor, his body cold, his eyes staring at a ceiling he couldn't see. In his hand, clutched tightly like a failed talisman, was the prescription Dr. Barnes had given him. The anti-vertigo drug. The 29-year-old had collapsed into a coma and died alone, his body starving for insulin while he followed the expert advice of a man who didn't know the difference between a balance disorder and a metabolic catastrophe. When Rick heard the news, the grief was quickly overtaken by a burning, incandescent rage. A doctor might make a mistake, but this felt like a void where knowledge should have been. Rick sat in the quiet of the empty clinic that evening. He looked at the framed diploma on Barnes's wall. He looked at the medical board registration. Something felt hollow. Something felt wrong. He picked up the phone and called the medical board in Sacramento. I need to verify the identity of a Dr. Gerald Barnes, Rick said. Could you fax over his identification photo and file? The fax machine hummed to life. The paper slid out, inch by agonizing inch. Rick watched as the image formed. The man in the photo was older, different features, a different bone structure. The address listed was in Stockton, 400 miles away. Rick looked at the photo, then at the empty chair in the director's office. You're not him, Rick whispered to the shadows. Who the hell are you? Chapter 5. The Pharmacist of Chicago. The investigation into the man who would be king of the clinic revealed a history built on layers of deception. Before he was Dr. Barnes, he was Gerald Barnbaum. In Chicago, he had been a pharmacist, a man who understood the chemistry of medicine but lacked the ethics of it. He had been caught in a Medicaid scam, a greedy little grift that cost him his license. But Barnbaum was a performer. He had been a theater student in college. He knew how to project a character. If he couldn't be a pharmacist, he would be something better, something more powerful. He had called the medical board, posing as the real Dr. Barnes. He told them he had lost his duplicate license and was opening a clinic in Los Angeles. They, trusting the name and the professional tone, mailed him the credentials without a second thought. It was that easy. A phone call, a lie, and a white coat. On August 8th, 1980, the curtain finally fell. The police arrived not to discuss a patient, but to escort the leading man to a cell. The charge, practicing medicine without a license, and, more importantly, manslaughter. But as Gerald Barnbaum sat in the back of the cruiser, he wasn't crying. He was already thinking about his next role. Chapter 6, the second act. Prison was supposed to be the end of the story. For the family of John Mackenzie, 3 years felt like a slap in the face. For the real Dr. Barnes, the damage to his name was a wound that wouldn't heal. But Gerald Barnbaum was a man of habit. 18 months later, he was out on good behavior. He walked out of the prison gates, looked at the California sun, and realized he didn't know how to be anyone else. He didn't go back to Chicago. He didn't find a trade. He went to a different city, found a different clinic, and put on a different white coat. He became Dr. Gerald Barnes again. He even got married. Lisa Roberts thought she had found the perfect husband. He was a doctor, a provider, a romantic who showered her with flowers and took her to concerts. He earned a 6-figure salary. He was the medical director of a Los Angeles facility. I'm so proud of you, Gerald, she would say as she kissed him goodbye in the morning. It's all for you, darling, he would reply. He lived this life for years. He saw patients. He ordered tests. He performed physicals for FBI agents. He was so good at the role that even the government's premier law enforcement agency didn't check the credentials of the man sticking a tongue depressor into their throats. Until a Christmas party in 1996. Rick D'Alessandro was there. He had moved on with his life, but he never forgot the face of the man who killed John Mackenzie. He was standing near the punch bowl when he saw a familiar, likable little guy wearing a name tag. Hi, I'm Dr. Barnes. The world stopped. Rick felt the blood rush to his ears. It had been 16 years, but the mask was identical. "Hi, Rick," the man said, his voice as smooth as silk. "How are you doing?" Rick stared at him, his fists clenching. "Well, Gerald, I'm not doing too well, because you're doing the same thing you did back in the 70s. The doctor didn't flinch. He gave a small, sad smile. "Well, Rick, this is all just a big mistake." He walked away, disappeared into the crowd, and then disappeared from the city. But the FBI was now on the trail. Chapter 7, The Highway Ghost. While Barnbaum was a predator of the clinic, a different kind of architect was emerging in the heart of the Midwest. David Brankel didn't wear a white coat. He wore expensive suits. He drove a black BMW. He was a businessman, a developer, a man with a vision. In Bloomington, Indiana, Brankel was the man to know. He rented an office from Phil and Bonnie Sperry, claiming to run an architectural and construction firm called ACR. Architecture, construction. And what's the R for, David? Phil Sperry asked one afternoon over coffee. Brankel smiled, a smooth, practiced expression that reached his eyes but didn't warm them. Results, Phil. Always results. But the R stood for robbery. Brankel was a man of dualities. Sunday through Wednesday, he was a family man in Vincennes, living in a rented house with a wife and a young son. Thursday through Saturday, he was a ghost on the interstate. He would drive his black BMW, a car he couldn't afford, to grocery store banks tucked inside Winn-Dixies and Measures. He used a simple disguise. A fishing hat, a mustache, a pair of tan coveralls. He would walk up to the teller and hand over a note. "I have a gun. Be quiet. Go home alive." He was efficient. He was calm. He was the interstate bank mart bandit IBM, and he was driving a path of financial destruction across 6 states. He had an accomplice, a woman named Donna Hewins. She was the Bonnie to his Clyde. A waitress he met at a club who fell for the thrill and the dapper suits. She sat in the idling BMW while David walked into the stores, a scanner in his hand, listening to the police frequencies. He was playing a game with the world. He was the successful entrepreneur by day and the most prolific bank robber in the region by night. He believed he was smarter than the detectives, smarter than the FBI, and certainly smarter than the people he scammed. Chapter 8, Operation Intercept. Detective Larry Duncan of the Louisville Metro Police was a man of maps. He sat in his office, staring at a cluster of pins that traced the path of the IBM bandit. Indianapolis, Louisville, Cincinnati. The pins followed the interstates like a trail of breadcrumbs. He's using the highways as his veins, Duncan muttered to his colleagues, Joe Schley and Agent Freihofer. He jumps on the I-65 or the I-71, and he's gone before the first cruiser arrives. Duncan had a theory. The bandit wasn't just a criminal, he was a commuter. He was likely based in Indiana, traveling out to hit targets and returning to his safe zone. In 2003, Duncan launched Operation Intercept. He placed undercover officers inside 5 target banks. He coordinated with 1,200 officers across the city. The trap was set. On September 6th, the IBM bandit struck hit number 35. The radio crackled. Operation Intercept. Operation Intercept. The call was too loud, too frantic. David Brankel, sitting in his BMW with the scanner hissing in his ear, heard the panic in the officer's voice. He didn't head for the interstate. He took the back roads. He slipped through the residential streets, weaving like a snake through the tall grass of the suburbs. Duncan watched the black sedan vanish on the horizon of his map. "He's gone," Duncan said, leaning back in his chair. "He's listening. He's always listening." Chapter 9, The Final Curb. Luck is a finite resource. For David Brankel, it ran out on a stretch of Highway 45 in December 2003. He was driving too fast. He was always driving too fast. He cut off a vehicle, nearly sending it into oncoming traffic. Unfortunately for Brankle, the man behind the wheel was Bloomington Detective Kevin Hill. The chase that followed was a symphony of screaming tires and 100-mile-per-hour desperation. Brankle disregarded stop signs. He ran people off the road. He was a man who had built a life on the belief that he could never be caught. And now the reality was catching up in his rearview mirror. He escaped the immediate pursuit, but he left behind a clue. He had dropped his license. Days later, in Vincennes, the Indiana State Police surrounded a house at 1919 Hickory. Brankle tried to run one last time. He abandoned his young son in the car final, chilling testament to his narcissism, and fled on foot through an apartment complex. He tripped on a curb. The Interstate Bank Mart bandit, the man who had hit 43 banks and stolen $136,000, fell face first into the dirt. As Sergeant Greg Winkler clicked the handcuffs into place, a small knife fell out of Brankle's pocket. It just fell out. Brankle stammered, the smooth businessman gone, replaced by a shivering, pathetic figure. I wasn't going to hurt you. Chapter 10, The Interrogation Room. The two worlds of deception met in the cold fluorescent light of an interrogation room. In one city, Gerald Barnbaum was being sentenced to 12.5 years, weeping about his prostate cancer and his grandchildren, even as the judge warned that he would do it all again if given a chance. In Vincennes, David Brankle sat across from Larry Duncan. I'm the guy you're looking for, Brankle said, leaning forward as if he were about to offer a business deal. I'm the IBM bandit. Call Louisville. Call Cincinnati. They'll want to talk to me. For 6 hours, Brankle talked. He told them about the first robbery. He told them about Donna. He told them about his mother, who told him he couldn't even mow the lawn right. He was a man who wanted to be the most successful bank robber of all time because he couldn't be anything else. He showed no remorse for the people he had cheated, the Sperrys, the Logans. He claimed he did legitimate work for them. He was a sociopath who had absolute no conscience. Chapter 11, the FBI's doctor, Murray Konjovsky, an FBI agent, stared at the file on her desk in disbelief. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The Bureau had a contract with a clinic in Los Angeles to perform employment physicals. For years, the man sitting in that office, the one who had checked the heartbeats and reflexes of over 100 FBI agents, was a man the government had already put behind bars. Gerald Barnbaum hadn't just fooled a clinic. He had fooled the premier investigative agency in the world. While the Bureau scrambled to assess the damage, Lisa Roberts sat in her living room, the space that used to be filled with the warmth of a loving husband. She now referred to him as the never was. I didn't know his real name, she whispered to the investigators. I didn't know his real age. Every night I shared a bed with a ghost. I trusted him with my life, my family, my future. Lisa realized that Barnbaum hadn't just stolen a name from a doctor in Stockton. He had stolen the years she could never get back. He had been a master of the mundane, playing the role of the devoted husband so convincingly that she never questioned why he never talked about his childhood or why he was so vague about his medical school days. Chapter 12. The Bus Ticket Blunder. In the world of bureaucracy, sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. After his 1996 conviction, Barnbaum was serving his time in a federal facility. In 2000, he was scheduled for a transfer because he had been categorized as a low-security inmate, a decision that baffled Agent Konjovsky. The Bureau of Prisons didn't use a secure transport. They gave Gerald Barnbaum a bus ticket. They told him to report to a facility in Illinois. Barnbaum took the ticket, walked out of the prison gates, and immediately vanished. He didn't go to Illinois. He went back to the only life he knew how to live. A month later, U.S. Marshal Joseph Exner walked into a North Hollywood clinic. He had a hunch. He didn't look for a man in a jumpsuit. He looked for a man in a lab coat. Gerald Barnbaum. Exner called out. A man stepped out of an exam room. He was wearing a crisp white coat, a stethoscope draped around his neck. He looked at the marshals and smiled that practiced. Clinical smile. "You guys are good," Barnbaum said, turning around to be handcuffed. He had been back on the job for weeks, seeing patients, prescribing controlled substances, and collecting a paycheck as Dr. Gerald Barnes. He was 63 years old, and he was already planning his next comeback. Chapter 13, The $9 Million Lesson. The fallout from Barnbaum's final act at Executive Health Group was catastrophic. Carl Jansen, an executive at Atlantic Richfield, had been one of Dr. Barnes's patients. He had undergone a full physical, including a prostate exam performed by a man with no medical training. I saw him on the evening news the next day. Jansen recalled, the disgust still evident in his voice. Handcuffs. The evening news. I had trusted this man with my health, my privacy. Jansen wasn't alone. Nearly 500 former patients joined a civil lawsuit. The evidence revealed a shocking lack of diligence. Executive Health Group hadn't performed even a basic background check. If they had, they would have seen the multiple felony convictions and the trail of dead and duped patients. The company was forced to settle for over $9 million. It was a price paid for greed and negligence, and it put the firm out of business. But for the victims, the money didn't erase the feeling of being violated by an imposter. Chapter 14, The Pet Store Dream. While Barnbaum was a ghost in the clinic, David Brinkle was a predator in the pet store. In Vincennes, Alan and Becky Logan were the embodiment of the American dream. They ran Logan's Wet Pets and More, a beloved local institution. They wanted to expand to build a family entertainment complex called Logan's Great Escape. When they met David Brinkle, they thought their prayers had been answered. He looked like a gift from God, Becky remembered. He had the suits, the Vanguard Capital marketing materials, the timetables. He looked legit. Brinkle charged them a $3,500 retainer and $500 a month. But his most chilling tactic involved his young son, Michael. On the first of every month, Brankle would walk into the pet store holding Michael's hand. He would have the boy hand the bill to Alan Logan. It was a prop, just like Barnbaum's stethoscope. The presence of the child created an atmosphere of trust, a sense that Brankle was a family man just like them. It's sad, Alan said years later, he used that boy to rob us. He had no conscience. Brankle was living a triple life, the devoted father in Vincennes, the entrepreneur in Bloomington, and the serial bank robber on the interstate. He was a sociopath who viewed people as meal tickets, and he didn't care who he stepped on to fund his dapper lifestyle. Chapter 15, The Last Act. In 2004, the curtain finally closed, at least for a while. David Brankle received 21 years in federal prison for 43 counts of bank robbery. Donna Humans, the waitress who became his getaway driver, received house arrest and probation. Brankle owed $175,000 in restitution, but for the Logans and the Sperrys, not a dime would ever return. Brankle maintained to the end that his work for them was legitimate. In Minnesota, at Vasica Federal Prison, Gerald Barnbaum, now in his 70s, sat in his cell. His projected release was 2018. Investigators who had tracked him for decades were not under any illusions. His age won't make a difference, one detective noted. He's a very dangerous human being. When he walks through those doors, he will be a physician again. He doesn't know how to be anyone else. The architects of deception had been dismantled, but their legacy remained in the lives they shattered and the trust they broke. They were men who proved that in a world of credentials and suits, a mask can be more powerful than the truth. As long as there is greed, and as long as there is a desire to believe in the perfect professional, there will be men like Barnbaum and Brankle, waiting in the shadows, ready to put on the coat and start the show all over again. Chapter 16, The Stockton Surgeon. While Barnbaum was busy playing doctor in Southern California, the real Dr. Gerald Barnes was living a quiet, respected life in Stockton. He was an orthopedic surgeon with 37 years of dedicated service. He was a man who believed in the sanctity of the medical profession, a man whose name was synonymous with trust. The first blow came through a radio broadcast. His wife was driving to a nearby town when the news report broke. Dr. Gerald Barnes arrested and found guilty of manslaughter. Gerald, you wouldn't believe what I just heard. She had told him, her voice trembling. At first, the real Dr. Barnes was in a state of clinical shock. He couldn't wrap his mind around the logistics of it. How could someone simply walk into a clinic and pretend to be him? How could they use his years of schooling, his residency, his surgical expertise as a costume? The shock soon curdled into a cold, hard anger. As he delved into the wreckage, he realized the imposter hadn't just stolen his name, he had turned it into a weapon. It almost gets to the point where you become calloused, the real Dr. Barnes admitted, because it happens so often. It wasn't just the medical fraud. It was the identity theft opening accounts, buying cars in my name, forcing me to change my driver's license over and over again. For 2 decades, the real Dr. Barnes was shadowed by a ghost. Every time he thought the problem was resolved, every time Barnbound was put behind bars, the nightmare would resurface. He was a man caught in a Kafkaesque loop, fighting to prove that he was the good guy, while the bad guy wore his face and his credentials. In 1996, he traveled to the federal court to look his imposter in the eye. He saw a man crying about his own health, a man who had shown no such empathy for the patients he had misdiagnosed or the lives he had ended. I'm convinced, the judge said, that if I were to set you free, there is a 100% chance you would do this again. The real Dr. Barnes watched as Barnbound was led away in chains. He hoped it was finally over, but deep down, he knew the ghost was still out there, waiting for the next bus ticket. Chapter 17, The Art of the Note. David Brankel considered himself an artist, not of the canvas, but of the heist. While most bank robbers were chaotic and desperate, Brankel was surgical. He targeted banks inside grocery stores for a specific reason. They were located near major interstates, providing a quick exit, and the security was often less intense than at a standalone branch. His demand notes were his masterpieces. They were clean, concise, and printed on plain paper to avoid leaving fingerprints. This is a hold-up. I have a gun. Be calm. Both drawers. Be quiet. Go home alive. Detective Larry Duncan of Louisville studied these notes with the intensity of a linguist. He noticed the lack of spelling errors, the precise punctuation, the cold, professional tone. This wasn't the work of a drug-addicted amateur. This was a man who planned his crimes with the same attention to detail he supposedly gave his architectural projects. Brankel's method was simple. Hit a city, move to the next, and always stay near the interstate. He followed a pattern that Duncan eventually decoded by staring at maps and interstates. He's doing exactly what I'm doing, Duncan realized. He's sitting in front of a computer, looking for